Okay, welcome to the deep dive. We're jumping into a stack of source material you've shared with us today.
Yep, ready to get into it.
And our mission, really, is just to unpack the core ideas, the key insights hidden inside these sources. Basically, give you that shortcut to being well-informed on what can be a pretty complex topic.
And today we're doing a deep dive into one specific article. It's titled Doug Casey and Matt Smith, Breaking Down the OB Act and the Future of the U.S.
Right.
And this piece, well, it offers a really pointed, definitely libertarian-leaning analysis of a major proposed bill, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or the OB Act.
The OB Act, okay.
And according to this source, it's already passed the House, and now it's, waiting on the Senate.
Exactly. And it's not just a dry summary of the bill, right? The article uses it more as a jumping-off point.
Yeah,
For
right.
broader commentary on tax, fiscal, even like the ideological direction of American governance.
Yeah.
But all seen through their very specific lens, it's important to remember.
Absolutely. So our goal here is to pull out the most important nuggets, maybe some surprising details, and really get to the core perspective that Casey and Smith lay out in this particular piece.
Okay, so let's start with the OB Act itself. How did they describe it in the article?
Well, as presented in this source, it's framed as a really sweeping bill. It touches on many different parts of the U.S. political economy,
Okay.
and they're definitely framing it primarily through a critical lens, focusing on what they see as its major downsides.
Right. And they jump right into the tax implications, which, let's face it, is often where a lot of the action is.
Always.
The first big point they seem to zero in on is making the Trump Tax Cuts and Jobs Act from 2017 permanent, extending it past 2025.
Yeah, that's a big one. And Doug Casey, in the piece, he clearly sees this as a positive. His argument is basically it means more money stays in the hands of citizens rather than going to the government.
Okay, straightforward enough from their view.
But the source does acknowledge the common counterargument that this move, well, it significantly increases the national deficit.
Right. And what's interesting is how Casey and Smith, according to the article, immediately dismissed that deficit concern. They don't seem too worried about it.
Not at all. They frame it not as like a failure of society or taxpayers, but as a fundamental failure of the government itself.
How so?
They use this really striking analogy. They say it's like, your house is overspending, but it shouldn't stop you from keeping your paycheck.
Wow. Okay, that's pretty direct. It definitely sets a tone.
Yeah, it really does. It tells you a lot about their perspective. Shifting to other tax changes, the article notes the child tax credit is raised to $2,500, though,
Yeah.
interestingly, only until 2028. And then there's a really significant change to the state and local tax deduction cap, the SALT cap.
Oh, yeah, the SALT cap. I remember that being controversial. What does the article say happens there?
Yeah. According to the article, it's raised dramatically, from $10 up to $40. But, and this is key, specifically for households earning less than $500.
Okay. And what's their take on that change?
The source sees this as a major benefit skewed towards blue states. They argue it essentially negates the tax advantage red states might have gained under the original lower Trump-era cap.
Interesting. So a political angle there, according to them. What else on taxes?
They also highlight some seemingly smaller tax exemptions in the bill, things like for overtime pay, tips, and loans specifically used to buy American-made cars.
Okay, those sound maybe less impactful.
Well, what Casey and Smith argue here is that these kinds of targeted exemptions, while perhaps sounding good on the surface, are really just, symbolic distractions.
Distractions from what?
From what they believe the focus should be on, which is calls for much more fundamental radical reform, like completely getting rid of the IRS or abolishing the income tax altogether. That's a core part of their view presented here.
Right, okay. That tracks with the libertarian perspective.
Exactly. There's also a more targeted tax in the bill they discuss. It hits large private universities, especially those with big endowments invested heavily in things like private equity.
Taxing the university endowments. What's their angle on that?
What's particularly interesting about their take on this is the questions they raise. They connect this tax to issues of transparency and even potential corruption within these institutions.
How so?
They use this provocative line likening them to basically hedge funds that just happen to have campuses attached.
Hedge funds with campuses. Okay, that's a memorable phrase.
Yeah. And finally, on the tax front, the article points out the repeal of clean energy tax credits.
Okay, rolling those back.
And interestingly, the scrapping of the IRS's own free direct file program, instead pushing towards private partnerships for tax filing.
And their view on that?
Their view here, according to the source, is that the IRS itself should ideally be the one calculating taxes for everyone, not pushing people to private companies.
Okay, so that gives us a good overview of their points on the tax side. Let's move into the spending and debt critiques. This seems absolutely central to their overall assessment of the U.S. system in the article.
Oh, completely central. Yeah. They bring up past attempts at reform, specifically mentioning Trump's promised DOGE initiative.
DOGE, what was that?
Yes, the article recalls the initial promise was $2 trillion in spending cuts under DOGE, which, by the way, the source note stood for Deep State Out Government Employees.
Wow, okay. Pretty telling name right there.
Definitely. But the reality, as presented by the source, was a mere $150 billion cut, which, they note, led to figures like Elon Musk quitting the effort in apparent disgust.
Only $150 billion out of $2 trillion promised. That's a huge difference.
Huge. And Casey's take on that experience, according to the source, is that it wasn't just a failure, but it was kind of a calculated PR stunt.
The PR stunt.
Yeah, one that ultimately served to highlight how deeply systemic and resistant to change the government bureaucracy is, in their view.
So the lesson they draw from that is?
The lesson they draw here is pretty stark. They argue that even incredibly wealthy and influential individuals like Musk are essentially powerless to reform a bureaucracy that, in their view, is designed primarily to protect and perpetuate itself.
That's a pretty bleak assessment of the possibility of reform from within.
It is. They also bring up these so-called Trump savings accounts mentioned in the bill.
Trump savings accounts, what are those?
It's a provision for $1,000 government-funded accounts for children born during Trump's term.
Okay. And Casey and Smith's take? Let me guess. Not positive.
Not positive is putting it mildly.
No.
Casey in the article doesn't pull any punches here. He labels this as welfare, pure and simple, just disguised as policy.
Welfare disguised as policy.
Yeah, and he uses strong terms. He calls it money stolen from all to benefit select groups. That's a direct quote used in the source.
Okay, very strong language. What about the debt ceiling? That's always a major point of contention.
Absolutely. The debt ceiling increase in the bill is another major point of criticism for them. The article highlights a massive $4 trillion increase.
$4 trillion.
Wow.
And they immediately label this a ticking fiscal time bomb. Their prediction is pretty dire, actually.
How dire?
They forecast that if, or maybe when, a financial crisis hits, annual deficits could potentially skyrocket to an astonishing $5 trillion per year.
$5 trillion annually. That figure really stands out. It's hard to even comprehend.
It really is. They also discuss the reforms to programs like Medicaid and SNAP. The article notes a push towards more state responsibility and enforced work requirement.
Okay, so some attempt at reform there, maybe.
Yep.
Controlling costs.
Well, while acknowledging this might curb spending somewhat, their view remains unwavering and goes much further.
Further how?
They argue these programs shouldn't just be reformed. According to the source, their position is that they should be abolished entirely.
Abolished. Okay, again, very consistent with that core philosophy. Exactly. Student loan policy also gets a revamp in the bill, according to the article. It mentions the end of federal subsidized loans and the implementation of stricter repayment terms.
And what's Casey's reaction to that, as presented in the source?
Doug Casey's reaction in the article is actually, maybe surprisingly, positive on this specific point.
Really? Why?
He lays the blame for sky-high tuition costs squarely on government intervention in the first place. And he argues these policies have created what he terms an indoctrinated generation.
Indoctrinated generation.
And a specific point he makes, which is interesting, is that student debt should be dischargeable through bankruptcy. Which, currently, for the most part, it is not.
Right. That's a key legal difference for student debt.
Yeah. Now, switching gears a bit, the Pentagon budget gets a heavy critique in the article.
I imagine so. What are the specifics?
The bill apparently adds a significant $150 billion with a stated focus on drones and unmanned systems.
Okay, and their commentary on that.
Their commentary here is particularly scathing, frankly. They deride the spending as flat-out wasteful capital destruction.
Capital destruction. Strong words. Did they give examples?
They use some really striking examples cited from the source, like billions allegedly spent on obsolete weapons systems. And they specifically mention a figure of 5,000 M1 tanks.
5,000 tanks.
That they claim are just rotting in storage. That image is pretty powerful, rotting tanks.
Yeah, that definitely paints a picture of waste.
And speaking of large sums, the article notes $70 billion allocated for border initiatives,
$70 billion for the border.
including $3 billion just for surveillance technology.
Okay, big numbers again. How do they frame that?
To put that $70 billion in perspective, the source pulls out a comparison, a historical comparison to the cost of World War II.
World War II. How does that compare?
They state the U.S. spent only $275 billion on that entire war in adjusted dollars. So $70 billion for border initiatives versus $275 billion for World War II. It's a comparison clearly designed to emphasize the sheer scale of current spending, particularly on the border.
That's a really jarring juxtaposition when you put it like that.
It is. Circling back quickly to the overall national debt numbers, the article quotes the CBO, that's the Congressional Budget Office.
Right, the official scorekeeper.
And the CDO predicts this bill alone will add another $3.88 trillion to the debt over the next 10 years.
Almost $4 trillion more, just from this one bill, according to the CBO.
Yeah. And Casey and Smith's belief, as stated very clearly in the article, is that this CBO figure is very likely an underestimate.
An underestimate. They think it'll be even worse.
That's their position. They emphasize how, normalized these trillion-dollar figures have become in discussions about government spending. It's like it's no longer even shocking, which they see as a key part of the problem.
The normalization of the massive numbers.
Got it. Okay, so beyond the purely fiscal aspects, the source also touches on some regulation and oversight included in the bill.
Like what?
Well, there's a point about a 10-year moratorium on state-level AI regulation.
A freeze on states regulating AI for 10 years. Why?
The stated intent, according to the article, is to prevent a fragmented patchwork of different state laws. Avoid 50 different sets of rules.
Oh, okay. I can see the logic there.
Yeah.
But what's the source's take?
Well, they note the underlying debate about whether centralizing control at the federal level is actually preferable in the long run for something like AI. It highlights that tension, state versus federal control.
Right. What else on oversight?
The article points out new power for the Treasury Department. Power to revoke the tax-exempt status for nonprofits deemed to be supporting terrorism.
Wow, okay. That sounds potentially significant.
Very. And they assume in the article that this is intended to include groups labeled as anti-Semitic.
And the criticism from Casey and Smith?
The criticism they raise here centers on the potentially vague language, what exactly constitutes supporting terrorism, and the significant concern about the politicization of who gets to decide which nonprofits are targeted. Who makes that call?
Yeah, that seems like a valid concern about potential misuse.
The article also weaves in some broader political and cultural commentary, not just policy specifics.
Okay, like what?
Well, they offer a critique of Trump himself, highlighting what they see as alleged self-glorification.
How so?
Through things mentioned in the source, like murals and memes depicting him as, historical or religious figures like Washington or even the Pope.
Okay. And how is that portrayed in the source?
Yeah, this is portrayed in the source as signaling an increasingly shameless and perhaps even autocratic tone from Trump. That's their interpretation.
Got it. Any other figures mentioned?
Yes, they also focus specifically on Rahm Emanuel.
Rahm Emanuel. What's the issue there, according to them?
The critique presented in the source centers squarely on his dual U.S.-Israeli citizenship.
Ah, the dual citizenship issue. What's Casey's view on that?
Doug Casey's view, as presented very clearly in the piece, is that government officials holding dual citizenship inherently pose a national security risk. Full stop.
That's a strong statement they include there.
Very. And they even bring in Kanye West, believe it or not.
Kanye. How does he fit into an analysis of this bill?
In the context of cancel culture, they mention him as an example of what they call real cancellation, allegedly orchestrated by Ari Emanuel, who is Rahm's brother.
Okay, so connecting it through the Emanuel brothers.
Exactly. And this is used in the article to raise broader cultural concerns about media control and the significant influence held by certain powerful figures in the entertainment and media world.
Interesting how they weave all these threads together.
Yeah. So pulling back, when you look at the whole article as presented, you can really see the core philosophical underpinnings that drive Casey and Smith's analysis throughout this entire piece.
Absolutely. You can't miss it.
Yeah.
There's that really strong thread of libertarianism.
Really.
That deep skepticism and critique of state power, welfare programs, high taxes, central planning, it just runs through everything they discuss.
And there's a clear awareness, or maybe a warning, about perceived elitism.
Yeah, whether it's about entrenched bureaucrats or university elites running those hedge funds with campuses, or politically connected corporate interests.
Right. And plus, they use a really potent moral framing throughout the piece.
What do you mean by moral framing?
Well, the state isn't really seen as a benevolent provider in their view. It's often cast as a predator.
A creditor.
Yeah, and government programs are explicitly framed not as aid, but as theft, money stolen from all. That language is really key to understanding their perspective as laid out here.
Okay. So how do they ultimately wrap up their deep dive into the OB Act in this article? What's the final takeaway?
Their conclusion, as presented in the article, is that the entire bill is essentially a microcosm of American decay.
A microcosm of decay. Wow.
Yeah, they see it as this mix of a few tiny, almost insignificant wins from their perspective, bundled together with symbolic gimmicks, but fundamentally resulting in just a structural expansion of government debt and government power.
So no real hope for positive change from this bill, in their view.
Not really. And their final pretty stark suggestion in this source is that the U.S. system, in its current form, isn't really savable through reform alone.
Not savable through reform. So what then?
They seem to predict it's more likely heading towards some kind of collapse under its own mounting weight. The weight of the debt, the bureaucracy, everything.
Wow. Okay. So that gives you a really clear picture of the perspective presented by Doug Casey and Matt Smith in this specific article. Their take on the OB Act and really their much broader view of the future of the U.S.
Yeah, we've walked through their key points as they laid them out. The permanence of the tax cuts, the massive spending additions they highlight for things like defense and border initiatives, and that relentless rise of the debt, all filter through their specific, highly critical lens.
And we touched on their analysis of those targeted tax changes, like the SALT cap and the university endowment tax. Their sharp critiques of what they see as spending failures, like that DOGE initiative, and how they view welfare programs.
Right, and also their take on broader issues they connect to all this, like the dual citizenship question or their commentary on cancel culture and media influence.
It's definitely a view that tries to hammer home the sheer scale of the national debt, the disconnect they perceive between government spending and any calls for tax cuts.
And they use those vivid, specific examples to make their points, like the tanks allegedly rotting in storage, or that really powerful comparison they draw between current border spending and the total cost of World War II.
Yeah, those examples stick with you.
And their core message, really, as presented loud and clear in this source, is that they believe the system is fundamentally broken and small-scale reform just isn't going to cut it anymore.
Which leaves us with this final thought, drawing directly from the perspective presented in the source material we discussed. If, as Casey and Smith argue in this article, the U.S. system might be fundamentally unsalvageable and potentially heading toward a collapse under its own weight, what does that particular viewpoint imply about the ultimate relevance, or maybe the impact, of even debating the fine details of specific bills like the OB Act in the first place?
That's definitely something to think about. If the ship is sinking, as they suggest, does arguing about the deck chairs really matter?
Exactly. A provocative thought to end on, based entirely on the perspective from today's source.